You've come to the place where Canada's best in college football is right here. This is Krown Gridiron Nation on TSN. And welcome to the Hubcast studio, everyone. I'm Jim Mullen. He's Gord Randall. Unfortunately, Mike Hogan is on the injury reserve list. Well, there were a number of Canadians in big-time games. We'll tell you how they did in our 2-minute offense. UCLA at number 19, Washington State. We start with the most exciting game of the week you may have missed. UCLA came back from a 49-17 deficit to win 67-63 at Wasu. J.J. Molson, the place kicker from Montreal with 11 points, was one of the differences for the Bruins. UConn, Indiana, nowhere near close on the scoreboard. Quarterback Jack Zurigotis was looking every bit a freshman, starting his second game, only 90 yards passing. But Montreal D-lineman Terrace Gagne with 5 tackles, and Edmonton's Lawal Ugwa keeps his sack a game pace alive. Ohio has had a challenging non-conference schedule. They managed to stay with Louisiana Lafayette through the first half, but then the Cajuns went a-raging in the second half. Ohio quarterback Nathan Rourke of Oakville, Ontario, 277 through the air, found the end zone once, but he served up 3 picks. Ohio 1-2. Conference play in the MAC awaits. Texas over OK State for the first time in 4 years. The Cowboys made it a game with Sherwood Park sensation Chuba Hubbard finding pay dirt. Calgary's Amen Agbangbamiga played through some hurt to lead OK State with 11 tackles. Former CFL receiver Robert Holland's kid is making an impression. The sophomore defensive back led an Oregon defense, which allowed only 6 points to the Cardinal. Oregon 3-1. More on Holland later. After a loss to Ole Miss, Southeastern Louisiana won comfortably over Lamar. Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and Champlain Cougar Isaac Berglund with 2 quarterback sacks, 4 over the last 2 games. Tennessee with only 3 on the board in Florida. Still, if you're just here to watch our guys, here's some good news. Brampton Jr. Josh Palmer with a pair of receptions for 24 yards. 21st ranked Virginia got a scare from Old Dominion early. The Monarchs opened up a 17-zip lead. The Cavs responded with a 24-point run of their own. Burnaby's Terrell Jana with 3 catches for 25 yards. This is the game that had top billing, Notre Dame and Georgia. And yes, the Irish led 10-7 at the half, but the Bulldogs had a strong second half, replying with 13 points of their own. A late TD by Chase Claypool made it a game, but they could not overcome the deficit. Notre Dame's playoffs for the Big Four are dangling by a string. I think there are many Canadians, even if they're not Notre Dame fans, would love to see Chase Claypool in the 4-team national playoff. But what sort of impact does this loss in Georgia have on Notre Dame moving forward?
Well, I would say that it's not an ideal result for Notre Dame, but it's also not a disastrous result for Notre Dame. It looked like it was starting to get away from them a little bit early in that second half, and then they managed to claw back late and actually had the ball at about midfield with a chance to win it late in this game. And in fact, it was our boy Chase Claypool who was targeted on that last play. Maybe a little bit of pass interference there, but when you got a jump ball over the middle, that often gets left up to the players to decide. But losing by 5 in a very hostile road environment, being right in that game shot for shot with Georgia, I think there's actually, despite the loss, more positives than negatives for Notre Dame here. Keeping it close is certainly something that voters will have their eyes on when you travel into a top 4 team in the country in their own barn.
So the one question we have remaining is, where does Chase Claypool fit in our stateside 5? Number 5, a new guy on the list, redshirt freshman out of Montreal, Alex Dumais with Fresno State, a sack and a forced fumble against those Sacramento State Hornets. Chuba Hubbard is back for OK State, 138 tough yards and 2 TDs in that loss versus the Texas Longhorns. Number 3, let's go all the way down to Division III St. Lawrence, Tyler Grishot from Stittsville, Ontario, the Paris of the Ottawa Valley. 393 yards and 4 touchdowns versus Morrisville State. This kid in 3 games has passed for 991 yards and 9 touchdowns. Over to the Pac-12 for number 2, Javon Holland of Oregon with 8 tackles, a TFL, and his first pick of the season against Stanford. And number one, it's receiver number one for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, Chase Claypool out of Abbotsford, BC. 6 receptions for 66 yards, a fumble recovery. This guy was in the center of the action in Georgia. Okay, that's our stateside 5. I allowed Hogan to go off the board once for a kicker. Now I'm going to allow you to go off the board for a kicker for your very favorite team in the whole wide world, the UCLA Bruins.
That's right, diehard UCLA fan with not much to cheer about in the last couple years. But this weekend, arguably the craziest game that you've seen this year, and certainly the craziest game you've seen this weekend, the Bruins overcame a 32-point deficit in the last 19 minutes. They actually took the lead twice in the fourth quarter, eventually walk away with a 67-63 win, with Montrealer J.J. Molson, their kicker, adding 11 points towards the effort, including 8 extra points off of those touchdowns. The Washington State quarterback in that game threw for 9 touchdown passes and lost the game. It was nuts, and most of you were in bed, and it's really unfortunate you missed it because it was an absolutely crazy game, one of the best I've seen, and a huge win for the Bruins, and a good effort from the Montrealer J.J. Molson, who's been pretty quiet to start the season.
Now for the guys who are actually in the stateside 5, 2 guys that we've been focused on all season long, and that is Chase Claypool and Chuba Hubbard. Chase Claypool looked like a senior out there who had studied everything about the game, making plays on special teams, drawing penalties to himself. Chuba Hubbard, he had some struggles out there, and he looked very much like a sophomore comparing these two.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of polish that needs to be added to Chuba's game still. Oklahoma State certainly gave him enough tries. I think he got 37 carries on the afternoon, and he still hit pay dirt twice, but only ran up to about 130 yards on the ground, and it was tough sledding at a lot of times for Chuba. And where he runs up against it right now is that he does not have the ability to create offense himself if he doesn't have enough help. And at times his offensive front got overwhelmed by the Texas offensive front, and he wasn't able to create things himself as much as possible. And Jim, one thing I would really like Oklahoma State to do more of with Chuba is to use him more in the passing game. I know I've said this before on this program, but he's a dynamic athlete in space, and in a game like this where the space wasn't there to be had in the more traditional running game, I really would have liked Oklahoma State to experiment with different ways to create the space for him so that they can unleash his track speed and get him out into the open.
Well, when we come back, we will check through the world of U Sports north of the border. You are watching Krown Gridiron Nation on TSN.
In British Columbia's Similkameen Valley, our partner Sunny Dhaliwal and his family grow and pack some of the finest fruit you will ever taste. Thank you, Sunny, for making Krown produce fresh at its best.
Welcome back to the Hubcast studio, everyone. Now it's time to look through U Sports in our 3-minute warning. Dinos and Rams. This was a sloppy, lackluster game as the Dinos jumped to an early 17-Cobb lead. Quarterback Adam Sinagra tossed up 347 for Calgary. The Dinos have walked their way to a 4-0 record. Now, if you're wondering where all the fun is, it was up in Edmonton. Huskies, Golden Bears. Alberta down by 1. They start the final drive at their own 4 with less than 2 minutes left. Those Golden Grahams would go 9 plays, 68 yards, setting up a freshman kicker, booting into a wind. Jonathan Giustini makes it by the hair of his chinny chin. The Alberta Drama Kings move to 3-1. Down east we go, Acadia Mount A. Axeman looking to continue to steamroll the opposition. That does not happen on this day. In the 4th, the Mounties tie it up on this 8-yard romp by Robert Walker. We are tied at 15. Acadia does respond. A 9-play, 105-yard drive capped by this 45-yard frolic by Cole Estabrooks. It's Acadia by 7. Will the real Rouge et Or please stand up? McGill goes into Laval and takes an early lead. It was tied at 17 at the half. We got a game, right? Well, no, they actually do stand up in the second half, going on a 20-0 run. Laval wins comfortably, at least with that second half effort. Queens over Toronto on the road. But look, Clay Sakara is still the leading candidate for the Heck Creighton Award. 345 through the air, 3 touchdowns, added another 110 with his feet. Real star of this game, Queens receiver Richard Burton, 7 receptions, 141, and a pair of tutties. Back over Windsor by a bundle, Andreas Duick with his best game of the year, 389 through the air and 3 TDs. His favorite target, Tommy Neal, 7 receptions and 127 yards. It's official, the Rock Fights have crossed the border from Quebec into Ontario. Western and Guelph combined for 12 points. Lucky for Western, they scored 9 of them to get the win. Sloppy game for both sides, but the Purple Ponies moved to 5-0. Well, Western's still the leader of the Power 7 until we roll out the next Power 7 later in the show, but that was not an impressive effort against Guelph on the offensive side. Now, we've heard that there was a flu rolling through the Western side. The guys were vomiting on the sidelines and going through all kinds of challenges. Or maybe that was an excuse. I don't know. But when it just comes down to field goals and no major scores for the leading team in the OUA, that's got to be a concern.
Yeah, I would say so. But what's not a concern for the Western offense is that Trey Humes was electric again, and it ultimately turned into Humes and the gang out there as he went over 100 yards on the ground and over 100 yards receiving on the afternoon. And despite not finding pay dirt, obviously, since the team didn't find pay dirt, he was outstanding in this game and ultimately made the difference for them. On the defensive side of the ball, maybe a little bit looser than we would expect through the air. Theo Landers passed in the mid-200s, which is a high number for him, actually. But in general, you still held the opponent to 3 points. So the good thing with Western is that their defense is stiff enough that they're always going to have a very high floor. And I don't know what was going on with the offense this week, but fortunately for them, they get the chance to get back firing on all cylinders with a date with Windsor this upcoming weekend.
Okay, let's go off to the Canada West now, where there's been some sloppy and ragged play, quite frankly. We've seen all the games throughout this season. The Regina-Calgary game was was sloppy to say the least. Calgary got out to that nice lead, and then there were fumbled snaps and missed assignments everywhere. It's been really quite discouraging to watch, but one thing that hasn't been discouraging is the resilience of the Alberta Golden Bears, and maybe patience is finally paying off in Edmonton.
Well, and it's about time. I mean, I know that there were some like us that were talking about what does Chris Morris's future look like if Alberta has another rough year this year. He's been around for, I believe it's been 6 years now. He's been there for quite a long time. He's one of the longer tenured coaches in the country with minimal success, aside from the year where Ed Elnicki dragged them to the playoffs almost single-handedly. But this particular brand of the Alberta Golden Bears looks like they are designed to go somewhere, and they've got dynamic athletes on offense. Jonathan Rosary's been outstanding again this year. Brad Lornhardt's really blossomed at the pivot position for them. And the big game changer for Alberta is with Greg Knox coming in, they finally have a legitimate defense that'll keep them in games. You look at the scores that they've given up, and they're in the teens or the 20s a lot of the time, and that's really good in this brand of football. So, Saskatchewan's no slouch of a team, so for them to just keep winning, especially given their recent history, it's all positives in Edmonton. And one thing that'll do as well, Chris Morris has always been an excellent recruiter, really punched above his weight that way. This is only going to grease the wheels even more on that side of the things as well.
When we come back, we will take a look at our games of the week on both sides of the border. You are watching Krown Gridiron Nation on TSN.
From the Similkameen Valley in British Columbia to the Western Cape of South Africa, our global network of grower partners produce the finest fruits and vegetables for Canadians. Those partners make Krown produce fresh at its best.
For the third week in a row, absolutely no change in our top 5 high school teams in the nation on our Canada Football Chat list. For more information and the total list, go over to CanadaFootballChat.com. And welcome back to the Hubcast studio here in Vancouver. 3 games to watch on each side of the border. Let's get to them right now. It's not your average Notre Dame-Virginia game. Notre Dame coming off that loss to Georgia. They need to win. Virginia on the upswing with that 4-0 record. They continue to climb in the top 25. And there are 3 Canadians in the spotlight. So, Gord, we got one established receiver, one emerging receiver, and one that's on a milk carton because we don't know where he is. He's dressed in the last 2 games. We're talking about Dejon Brissett. Let's start from the bottom up. Is this the game where we see Dejon Brissett return to his form of 2 years ago with Richmond?
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, Dejan Brissett's a speedster who is battling a hamstring injury that may still be hampering him a bit. It may also just be that this is an undefeated team so far, and they've been pretty successful, so they may not want to mix up what's been working for them, and in particular, what's been working for them has been Terrell Jana.
Yeah, Terrell Jana, maybe not receiver number 1 with this Virginia squad, but certainly 1A or receiver number 2.
Yeah, I would say based on game plan on any given week, he could be their top receiver, and he's certainly in the mix as such. He was very quiet this past week against Old Dominion, but in the week previous, he was their best receiver against Florida State in that win. So he's been a prominent face for them, and I think moving forward, they're going to need to rely on him to be a consistent voice, a consistent presence in their offense.
Do we want to save a little bit on Chase Claypool for later in the show? We talked a lot about him in the front end of the show. I think we've got some heroics that we want to talk about later in the show, right?
Yeah, I mean, we alluded to him in the front end of the show, but one thing I will point out at this juncture is that it's no coincidence that Notre Dame's offense was most successful when they had him most involved this week, in my opinion. And he's one of those guys at this point in time for them that whether he's actually coming down with balls or he's drawing attention, drawing penalties, whatever it is, he's a guy that remains a focal point of their offense and needs to remain a focal point of their offense moving forward.
Queens versus Laurier. Gales coming off that big win in Toronto. As for Laurier, they are looking down the barrel of missing the playoffs in consecutive years. The last time that happened was 1990. I'm not sure if this is something that we expected, a real gut check time for Laurier this early in the season around the midpoint.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, they're coming off their bye here, and it's probably been a pretty tough 2 weeks in that building because if you remember, their last showing on the field was an epic 19-point collapse in the fourth quarter when they traveled to Ottawa to play the GGs. So they need to bounce back, and they need to bounce back in a hurry as Queens comes in coming off of a big morale-boosting win at the University of Toronto last week. And as for Laurier, one of the things they really need to get going on offense is they need to get Lavondre Gordon going more. His numbers aren't bad, but this is a guy that we saw as one of the best running backs in the country for the last couple of seasons, and he has been not that level up to this point in this season. And other thing that's been that had been stereotypical of Laurier when they were one of the contenders in the OUA was a fearsome defensive front, and it's been a little bit more muted this season. So there's a couple things that need to get going, and then I would say I would be remiss without mentioning all of the special teams gaffes at the end of that Ottawa game. They've really got to clean that area of their game up too, Jim.
Oklahoma, Texas Tech, the start of Big 12 play for the Sooners. This is the unofficial launch of an Oklahoma play for a national playoff spot. The Sooners are on a 7-game win streak against Texas Tech. Well, there's no bread in this sandwich of a schedule for Oklahoma. It's all meat for Neville Gallimore and company moving forward, isn't it?
It is, and I do think the Big 12 is in pretty good shape this year. They've got a couple of top 25 teams coming up on the schedule. They've got Texas in, I believe it's 2 weeks' time in Austin. That's going to be a tough one for them. And then 2 weeks after that, they travel to the bustling metropolis of Manhattan, Kansas, to play the K-State Wildcats, who are also in the top 25. And we talked earlier about how Oklahoma needs to hold serve and win out. They might have room for one loss, but they need to win the Big 12 outright and either be undefeated or have one loss to have their college football playoff hopes remain alive. And in particular, that Texas game looks like it's shaping up to be for all the marbles in the Big 12 if everyone else holds serve. So they've got a couple big games coming up. They can't afford to overlook the Texas Tech Red Raiders this upcoming weekend in a game that should be, at least on paper, a pretty easy victory for the Sooners.
When we come back, it's our Triple W2K and Weekend Warriors. Stick around.
Every down, pass, rush, and kick brings us closer together. This is how we play. Here is why we play. It takes a team to play football, and it takes Football Canada to help keep amateur players in the game. From playgrounds to stadiums.
Yes, it's our U Sports Power 7. No changes 1 through 6, but a big change at 7 as we move Ottawa up into that spot, and Acadia drops out after they struggled against Mount A. Yes, it's weekend Warriors time. It's only going in one direction. It's going over to you, Gord.
Sure, I'm going to pick Chase Claypool, and I know that I'm going way off the board on this one, but in watching that game at Georgia, it was clear how many different ways Chase Claypool is able to impact games right now. He's one of the better blockers out there on the edge. He drew a couple pass interference calls. At times he drew double coverage, but if you forgot about him, he always came through. And I mentioned earlier in the show that Notre Dame's offense was more productive the more they got Claypool involved, but also recovered a massive fumble return on the punt team to set up their first touchdown as well. I would say of the Fighting Irish players on the night, Claypool was one of the one or two most impactful guys in all sorts of different ways. And for that, maybe being a little under the radar, Chase Claypool, you're my weekend warrior.
My weekend warrior comes out of Tennessee Tech, originally from Burlington, Ontario. He's a true freshman, and his name is Cale Dava. And this kid produced a sack versus Western Illinois. That makes for 2 sacks in 2 games. Quite an effort by a true freshman. Triple W2K, obviously you're the only one here, so go for it.
Can I talk about UCLA again?
Absolutely not.
Oh, come on.
No.
Okay, fine. In that case, I'm going to stick with the local arena here, and we're based in Vancouver, as most of you out there know. My question is, which local team between the Simon Fraser Clan and the UBC Thunderbirds are going to figure out who their quarterback is first and right the ship first? Because they're both winless to this point. SFU had their guy in Justin Siebert, and he got hurt. They've cycled through a couple different guys since then. UBC's cycled through 2 different guys as well, with Gabe Oliveira playing this past weekend after Tommy Yanchuk started. So, who's going to find their guy and turn the ship around first here in the Lower Mainland?
What I want to know is who's taking a medical redshirt heading into the next phase of the draft. You've got Sage Dockstader, a very talented offensive lineman who hasn't taken a snap with New Mexico State, and Patrice Rene, who went down in Game 2 for UNC. We'd like to see them up at the next level, but we might also like to see them for another full season at the Division I level. What I want to know is which way are they going? That'll do it for another edition of Krown Gridiron Nation. A reminder that our podcast is available on all kinds of platforms. But for now, this is Jim Mullen saying, let's get out to the game.